All right, so we've already looked at imperialism in Africa a little bit. We're moving now to look at imperialism in Asia as kind of a little mini summary of this topic. So I understand that the biggest thing for Asian imperialism has been going on for quite a while now, ever since Magellan sailed around the world and went through the Philippines, was the demand for Asian goods. So big things that are very popular in Europe at this time, still the spices, all right? Still things like pepper and cinnamon, all those kind of good things that can only be grown in certain places of the world. Porcelain from China. So fine China, we call it, you put the fine China for people. Porcelain, a very unique type of pottery found in China, was one big thing that people really wanted. Also, silks were a big thing. Silk cloth only grown in China, and China kind of prepped the limit on what could be available that way in terms of silk and silkworms being released. And lastly, tea. The idea that tea is available for people, and that's a really big one because obviously one of the national drinks of Great Britain is tea, and so that's a big deal. Now, obviously, our early players were the Dutch and the Portuguese, who have settlements in Asia, going back to the 1600s. Later on, Britain and France stick their grubby little noses in everything here, too. Now, while we talked about Africa as being this whole issue of the Berlin Conference and claiming land, Asia is more about being a sphere of influence. So the idea that you're going to try and influence certain areas to come to your side and to work with you. And each of these countries, Britain and France and Portugal and the Dutch and the German, United States, so on and so forth, are going to try and exude, kind of put their influence in on different parts of Asia. And that's what they're going to try and do. And they're trying to have who they can influence to work with them, trade with them, less direct control than we see otherwise. Now, the Dutch, are picking on them first, is that they have the Dutch East Indies, which essentially down here is in Indonesia and Malaysia, New Guinea, Java, etc., right down here where I'm circling around, right down here. Okay, that's where you're going to see the Dutch hang out. And it's only the guys of the Dutch East India Company, but it kind of is really controlled by the Netherlands as well. Now, all these things are growing. They're actually non-indigenous crops. Know about coffee, right? What's the nickname for coffee? It's called Java. Well, coffee does not originate from Java, ladies and gentlemen. Instead, the Dutch put it there. All right, growing tea. Tea is from China. They put it down here. Rubber trees from Africa. Cocoa from the Americas. Opium from China and India and Afghanistan. They grew all these things in this area because they could. And there were a lot of non-indigenous crops they dragged into here because they wanted to become cash crops, okay? Whether it be coffee and tea to relax and steam as people wanted, rubber for tires and equipment, chocolate and sugar for those luxury goods, lastly, opium to be used in medication or opium dens, whatever it might be. They grew these things here. Now, to grow this, they set what's called a cultivation system in Indonesia, in Java. It was very much like a Corvée or a robot that we found in Europe. So it's almost kind of like serfdom, essentially, is what we're talking about here. We saw the same thing in Belgium with, requiring to bring a certain amount of rubber every day. And essentially, the Indonesians were required to supply a certain amount of product every year or monthly, where it might be, to the Dutch government. And so it was one of two things. Either one, they'd put 20% of their land, to use for Dutch government products, and then 60 days a year of labor. Now, think about it. If you're a farmer, 6 days a year is a lot of time, and 20% of your cropland is also a lot of cropland. Now, granted, the Dutch, they were going to pay you for this, and what they paid the workers for this was in copper coins. The copper coins were essentially useless money. It was just kind of a ruse to say, hey, look, we're paying you, woohoo, you know what I mean? And these Dutch middlemen paid, quote unquote, for these goods with these copper coins, process them, and send them to Holland. Now, the Dutch people did do things like infrastructure, like railroads and mines and that kind of stuff, but it wasn't as big as we see in like parts of Africa. Now, the biggest issue is that most of the people were very, very poor. These copper coins bought nothing, and they used a lot of their crops and stuff to grow these cash crops, and were basically getting hosed on it. And so you also had famine become a big deal because a lot of their crops aren't being used to grow food crops, are being used to grow cash crops and being sent off to the Netherlands. So that's a big problem there. Netherlands got rich off this stuff, okay? They have more industrialized, all that kind of stuff. They were the most, believe it or not, powerful, economies in the late 19th century until recession hit at the turn of the century. But that's because they had all these raw materials coming in, and they could do that versus other places. Now, Britain's big thing, obviously, is India. And India was kind of where they landed. And they had fought, they got control of India through the 7 Years' War, kind of kicked the French out. And it was being ruled by the British East India Company up until 1857 with Parliament as well. Now, it was indirect rule. So typically the Mughals, which are the Mughals, which are the Islamic rulers, as well as the Maharajas, who are the Hindu rulers, would work with the British people, and they would, through trade and stuff and treaties, they would kind of rule the local areas, and then they would be kind of informed or told how to do things by the East India Company or by the British. Now, one of the ways to keep control of everything was through the use of sepoys. Sepoys were Indian soldiers who were working for the British East India Company. Now, one of the problems they had in 1857 was a rebellion. What happened was they were greasing the cartridges for the guns with pig and cow fat to make them slide down the barrel better. Here's the problem. You have Muslim soldiers, you have Hindu soldiers who cannot eat either, one, for Hindus, beef, and then for Muslims, pork. Big problem, right? And they said, we can't do this. And we'll look more at this detail a little later on. But they had a big rebellion. The rebellion was put down by the British East India Company, British government, and this led to direct control of India by Britain because they said we cannot have rebellions happening and have British citizens be in danger. They took over directly. And so they created what's called the Indian Civil Service. This was essentially a British governor in charge, right? And then civil servants who were Indians trained in Britain and brought back. Some were Indian, some were British. It was a great chance for, younger sons of low-ranking aristocrats, people who weren't going to get a lot of land, to get a job and get ahead and kind of get their name out there a little bit for big government jobs. Educated people who were Indian had an opportunity to do these kind of things because they got to get an education in Britain, learn English, that kind of stuff, and kind of learn the tools of trade and government that way. And so this Indian civil service is created. And people like Gandhi and Nehru, who later on become big players in Indian government, are part of this Indian civil service. Now, the downside of this ruling in India were something called home charges. So to finance all this government the British were doing in India, they put taxes on pretty much everything, okay? And so they taxed the Indian population to pay for all this administration because they had an army there, they had a government there, they were building roads and railroads and harbors and bridges and all that kind of crap, okay? And so they put taxes on stuff. So if you use a railroad, they give you a tax. If you were in debt and took a loan out, they put a tax on it. If you had any help at all from the military or civil service, you put a tax. The biggest one, honestly, is probably the salt tax. Every single food stuff, and even salt, which you need to live, I mind you, okay, was taxed. And so it was not really good for the Indian people, okay? And essentially, we start destroying a self-sufficient economy because you have this really great agricultural country, and they just basically start taking the stuff away from the land to send it all to Britain. So growing things like tea and wheat and cotton, all that kind of stuff, and sending it away. Really, honestly, India's wealth gets exploited the crap out of it. It's never industrialized, never put any industry there, and nothing really works out. You also have a problem of man-made famines. When famine hits, like we saw in Ireland about 50 years earlier or so, all the goods and stuff, end up going to Great Britain, and none of the stuff goes to the Indian people. So you have famine that hits and takes out huge chunks of Indian population. And even have, if you were in debt, you had to go to work camps, those kind of things where there's a 94% death rate during famines. And here's some images we're talking about. Here's the tea farm that we look at. Here's tea being grown in India. And here you have things like, the tea leaves, where they're working. Here you have workers who work camps during times of famine who allow these people to starve to death and die. There is a push starting in 1885 for Indian nationalism. And so it's going to, from the first times we start seeing the British government and the British Empire kind of start falling apart, where we still have a group of educated Indians get together and try to make their own parliament, kind of like we saw in Ireland, kind of same deal, right? And make deals and kind of take a more political route with the British, and they actually get kind of a semi-autonomous rule kind of situation by 1905, but they're still being ruled by the British. You'll see people like Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru, different leaders kind of step up here and lead the protests to have Indian freedom. And obviously Gandhi being the big one with his peaceful protests and salt marches and hunger strikes, all those kind of things. There's also a Muslim League, which were a group of Muslims from the north, who also did the same kind of deal, but tend to work better with the British. And so actually Britain ended up giving Muslims more rights than they gave Hindus because they're working more with the British. So when 1948 rolls around after World War II, we'll talk about decolonization, hopefully, before the test comes. When Indian freedom happened, there's a big Hindu-Muslim conflict because Muslims had a lot more power in terms of ruling over the area than Hindus did. And that's where we see Pakistan, India break apart. Cough, cough, notice playing different cultures against each other. Yeah, that happens, okay? And so that's how we see this whole thing go down. Last place we'll look at, last example is China, okay? The president's favorite country. So goods were from China were in long demand, right? Porcelain being the biggest thing, also tea and opium, those kind of things. And all of Europe really wanted these goods. It was like huge, big deal, okay? And it leads to previous issues. In the 1830s and 40s, there was something called the Opium Wars, because what happened was the British were bringing opium into China to trade for tea. Opium was being grown in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and being traded. Well, China said, we don't want opium in our country, and started kicking them out. So they had wars basically fought to have this opium trade take place. Heck, the British and French even invaded in 1857 and burned down the Chinese emperor's summer palace, trying to open that trade up. And eventually we started having trade treaties happen in China that allowed Britain to open up ports, especially Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was a British entity, a British colony until 1997 when it was given back to China. And so there's kind of a lot of conflict about China not wanting, being very closed off, and Europe doing every single thing it can, trying to weasel its way into China. Now, eventually, we have what's called open door policy, 1898, because the U.S. kind of got stepped in with their warships, made that happen, and everybody kind of set up shop. Russia and Germany and France and Britain all kind of invested tons of money in China to modernize China and make it better. And we see a big European influence. So things like language and culture and stuff in China starts changing because of all this European influence, which angers some of the hardline conservatives in China called the Boxers. They had the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, where the uprising happens. They start killing off European people, European foreigners like the British, the French, even the United States. And this group of countries all kind of jump in and kind of put it down with military force because they say our people are being killed. I would say it's a little touch to add on to your textbook, what we already have about imperialism in Asia. Thank you much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. I really, really appreciate it, and hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day.